Could the Googles and the Amazons of the world take over from governments? The sheer size of so many corporations certainly gives them tremendous power, and with that can come great influence. You're watching Roundtable. And a very warm welcome from me, David Foster. Multinational companies, transnational companies, almost intergalactic companies span the world with their immense number of employees and their international buying power. Are they now starting to mobilize their workers to shift public policy?
Multinational corporations like Apple and Amazon are growing globally, not only in size, but also in power. Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg even referred to his company as more of a government. With all their user information, groups like Facebook wield enormous influence. That became evidence when Facebook admitted the consultancy Cambridge Analytica gained access to nearly 90 million users through the platform. Information that could have been used to shift opinions at the ballot box. And it doesn't end there. At a time where states offering affordable housing to citizens is in high demand, Google recently announced a $1 billion housing investment plan in San Francisco. So as more companies take on the roles of states, will it be global corporations who dominate the future?
And I'm very pleased to say that joining us from Sicily, where Google just happens to have had a massive international bash, we have Lorenzo Marsili, Director of European Alternatives. We'll talk about Google and Sicily later. With me at the round table, Dorothy Guerrero, Head of Policy at Global Justice Now, campaigning for an international treaty, and Professor Collins Ntim, an expert in corporate social accountability from the University of Southampton, from the Business School there. Great to have you with us on the programme. Lorenzo, let me come to you first of all. What is it you've written? You said that these are the new planetary powers and states are becoming more and more irrelevant. What do you mean by that?
Well, it's an old trope of science fiction. If you think of Blade Runner, if you think of the 1930s science fiction, we have gigantic multinationals that take up state capabilities and become more powerful than many nations are. And that is no longer science fiction, but is rather the reality that's confronting us. We have multinational corporations that not only control vast amounts of personal data, giving them a power of prediction over our actions that almost no nation state can actually boast, but these corporate nations are actually mobilizing their own users in order to get the best concessions they can out of governments. Whether that's Airbnb or Uber mobilizing their consumers in order to protect their scandalous privileges in the relative market, or whether it is all multinational corporations playing state against state in order to have unacceptable tax privileges. And we know that Apple pays 0.0005% of taxation in Ireland. We know that the same applies to Google and to many more. So I think we should really be facing the fact that we have planetary powers that are becoming more powerful than democratic politics is, and that maybe calls for a new understanding of what international politics and globalization should look like.
You see, what I'm wondering here, Dorothy, I'll ask you this one first of all. Are we seeing something sinister here in terms of a world takeover, or is this simply massive corporations wanting to make massive profits and being successful at doing so?
Well, actually, what I would say is that what Lorenzo mentioned about the power of corporations, especially transnational corporations, is already here. When we talk of trade, the reality is that we now have an asymmetry of power between corporations, people, and governments. And how did this happen? It did not happen overnight. It happened through relations between these three sectors. And the fact that governments sign into trade treaties and give away their powers, because what happened with these free trade agreements is that you have an investment provision called investor-state dispute
settlement. Can we go into that in a little bit of time? Because I want to go back to that very question. Is this a sinister takeover, or are these simply massive companies, corporations, trying to make the most money that they can?
Well, partly because they have a duty to reap profits for their stakeholders, but then at the same time, they could change policies. What I'm saying before is that with the global trade and investment regime that we have, corporations can send policy chill to governments and make them change their
But
policies.
do you think that's what they want to do ultimately, rather than just make money?
Well, they have their interests, which is different from the responsibilities and interests of governments and people. And in this relationship, it's not balanced.
Collins, do you think there is a plan here to do more than just make a lot of money, that there is a plan? Because even if you influence governments to make you money, your ultimate aim is to make you money. But is there a plan to do something more than that here?
Well, I mean, my view on this is, it's not different from Lorenzo and Dorothy, but the way I come to this is that the corporations are already here. They're large, they're big, and they're part of us. We are interdependent in the sense that the corporations are dependent on us as nations and people, and the corporation depends on us. And the question, therefore, for me, is how do we ensure that this relationship works better for all of us? The corporation, I accept the corporation ought to make profit for a start.
But do they want power other than to maximize profits?
Well, my view is that I think, yes, when uncontrolled or unchecked, the corporation will want to amass as much power as possible in order to maximize profit.
Okay, so it's not world domination other than in monetary terms. Yeah. You can all say whatever you want at any one time. Lorenzo, let me come back to you. Walmart, biggest corporation in the world. It's got a bigger economy than Spain, Australia, than the Netherlands. It has 6,000 retail outlets outside the United States. But that's not the sort of company necessarily we're talking about. We are talking about Apple, number 23 on the list, bigger than Belgium, bigger than Mexico. You've got to differentiate, haven't you, between the different companies?
You have to differentiate because they clearly have different strategies, different interests, and a different kind of impact. Walmart's impact on the labor market, for instance, is much more significant than Apple's. That's true in the United States, where Walmart is driving the race to the bottom in labor standards. And it's also true in countries abroad. Walmart is instrumental, actually, in driving down the cost of labor in China, thereby, in fact, heightening the tensions around labor between China and the United States. So, yes, you have to differentiate, but you're just differentiating ways in which these companies, uncontrolled by democratic mechanisms of accountability, are causing problems and are damaging.
So which do you think is more dangerous, an information technology company, such as the Apples, the Googles, etc., or perhaps a massive physical corporation, such as Walmart? Can you say?
I think they're blurring. I think what we're witnessing at the moment is the employment of data and digital technologies on the part of traditional companies, and the distinction between the two is increasingly blurry. Amazon is one of the largest employers in the world, and at the same time, it's a platform capitalist company. But if you allow me, this is something we've seen before with the merge between traditional corporations and financial capitalism. We know that General Motors or Tesco or the large Walmarts of this world are actually banks. They actually have financial institutes as much as traditional companies. And the same blurs, the same merge is happening between digital and traditional companies.
I'm so glad you both want to come in, but I don't know which one of you to choose
yes,
first.
Yes, I think it's okay. Yes, indeed. I mean, my take on this is that in the end, it's not really about the size of the corporation that matters, because these corporations are actually, if you look at it carefully, it's owned by a few. So even if there's a small company out there, ultimately it's controlled by a much larger one. So my view is that what do they result in? Google, big as it is, can lead, when on check, social media on check, we saw what happened yesterday, for example, in the US, 2 days ago, or 3 days, a day ago in the US, for example, where people are exploiting social media, which have reduced the boundaries of nations and leading to some sort of killings of people. Now, that is the same as Walmart or any of the larger mining firms, destroying water bodies or the environment in Africa or any of the developing world. And so the consequences, in the sense, the negative consequences of corporations are quite, in my view, similar whether they are large or small. Ultimately, of course, there is relativity in terms of the magnitude of the of the impact.
I think I want to go back on the question of power, especially the power of transnational corporations. And very, very few people know this, that at this point in time, corporations, because of the free trade agreements that governments entered into, now have the power to sue governments when they think that their profits are at stake, or if there are regulations that they think could change the way they operate. So how did that happen? There are cases, for example, like the latest one that we are campaigning on the case between a British company, Lydian Mining, that operates a gold mine in Armenia. So the contract was signed between Lydian and the former government, and the people in the communities and adjacent area felt that with the gold mine, their water sources will be polluted. So they started protesting. They started to stop the operations of the gold mine. And now, Lydian Corporation is threatening to sue the government of Armenia so that it will take away those people that are protesting and stopping their operation. So that is a very
isn't what you're
concrete
saying
example.
evidence of the fact that throughout history, whilst we've had the capitalist society, then corporations have a measure of power. What we're talking about here is sort of international, transnational power.
Yeah. Well, the ISDS is an international instrument, legal instrument, that corporations can use to sue governments. While on the other hand, communities that are affected by pollution, by those that are operating against workers, for example, in terms of following the minimum law, they don't have that right to sue corporations. They have to go through states or through to the government. So this imbalance of power means governments can be easily bullied now when corporations will say, okay, I will go to the arbitration court in The Hague or wherever and sue you for your new policy. And there are now almost 1,000 cases of this investor-state dispute settlement. And the corporations are winning.
But 'twas ever thus, was it not? I mean, bullying capitalism, as suggested by some people, has always put down the little person, and nowhere more than in Sicily, Lorenzo, the last couple of weeks have we seen the power of big international companies. Google paid something like $20 million to get all of these bigwigs from major corporations together for what they called the Summer Davos. The island was blocked out, wasn't it? It was difficult to move around, and here they were flying in their private jets, all talking about global climate change and other good things.
Yes, it's just like the tax evading elites talking about the fiscal crisis in Davos. They even instituted a no-fly zone over the part of Sicily that was concerned, which is a clear sign of a state gathering. Normally, these sort of no-fly zones are set up during the G8 or G20 or other such international gathering, not for a private gathering of a few rich people. So there is already a sign of the kind of state-like power that they are yielding. I think what we should be asking ourselves is what can be done. Yeah. As you mentioned, in the history of capitalism, large capital has a tendency to trample over the little people and eventually destroy the very ecosystem on which capitalism is premised. Capitalism unconstrained has this kind of suicidal tendency, which is why it needs a public body to limit and constrain and humanize and rationalize it. And at the moment, because of the gap between a transnational economic space and a nationalized space of politics, we don't have this counterpower to unfettered neoliberal capitalism. And that's what we should actually be quite busy constructing.
Before,
for example,
before we talk about how that's possible, and I know you've been working on a treaty, you hope, for years and years now, let me ask each one of you, Lorenzo, since you're talking, you carry on. Is there a danger that they will take over from governments and states and nations?
Yes, some parts of the competencies. I think what we are witnessing is a fragmentation of what used to be traditional state competencies, and these competencies are now becoming fragmented, some of which remain to nation states, some are taken over by transnational institutions, which may be more or less democratic, whether that's the EU, the African Union, the UN, and some are taken over by private actors such as global corporations. It's a kind of new medieval system, if you like.
Okay, Collins?
Yeah, but what I see is a hybrid. So in a sense that what I mean by that is that there will be aspects, particularly the economic aspects, which will be dominated by multinational corporations, in particular transnational bodies such as the IMF, the International Chamber of Commerce, and so on. that will be driving those kind of forces. But if you take the basics of politics, the lawmaking and so on, governments and nation states will continue to have control. Now, ceding the economic control to transnational bodies, supranational bodies in particular, not necessarily multinational corporations, I don't think is necessarily a bad idea, given that the world is a globalized world already. I mean, it's a global economy. No country can have absolute control over any source of production.
But this then brings me to a particular conundrum, and I will come to you in just a second, Dorothy, which is if countries and corporations have to live symbiotically. If it's you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. Why are so many big corporations getting away without paying tax when that would be an element of the you scratch my back? In other words, you, the corporation, give me, the country, some money and we'll give you power. Why aren't they doing that? Well, because they're worried that other countries will take them on and thereby have the influence they might have lost.
No, that's absolutely, that's a good point, David. And the starting point is to look at, for the corporation, how can they maximize or generate profit, but still be able to make the contribution that we expect them to make, in the sense that, well, pay their taxes, their fair share of the taxes.
The point I'm trying to make is why do countries need them if they're not paying their taxes and scratching the country's back?
Okay, well, I think we need them because the corporate form to date has been the most successful form of production of goods and services. I mean, without a corporate form, we've seen other forms. You have communism, you have, other forms of production which have quite often not worked.
So it would just be a benefit if they paid their taxes. That's
absolutely
not part of the big picture.
That's my view. And the question is, how do we ensure that they do that?
And accountability, this is your big number, Dorothy, isn't it? You've been working on trying to get a UN treaty for 5 years.
Yeah, since 2014, when it was agreed in the Human Rights Commissions of the United Nations. Well, I will go back to the power, because it's not just the power to evade tax or the ability, or because we have here a relationship between government and corporations, wherein governments have incrementally stop or renege on their duty to protect the interests of people and protect the environment. And I think that is danger to democracy.
What would your treaty do if you managed to get it through?
The UN binding treaty on transnational corporations will put a globally binding law that could stop operations when they are operating with corporations when they are operating with impunity. It could compel the transnational corporations to observe workers' rights, human rights, labor, environmental standards. But the thing is also...
But it would be nothing other than a piece of paper, would it? Because countries and companies currently ignore countless UN treaties.
Well, that is one aspect. But the thing is, at the moment, there's no existing law. While for transnational corporations, you have 3,400 laws and policies backed by all these free trade agreements. So you have 4,300 laws, while people and their communities don't have that kind of law.
A starting point. It would be better than nothing.
It could be a starting point. And at the same time, the governments can use it as well to complement their national law. For example, to demand for due diligence, to simply make corporations observe standards and all those laws. And the thing is, it will have teeth. Because at the moment, corporate social responsibility, for example, are voluntary.
Well,
at the end of the
whether
day,
it has teeth or not,
corporations
it may have a set of rather
want.
poor-fitting dentures. We would have to go. Lorenzo, do come back on this one, because this is something I'm quite interested in. Looking at the figures, 30 years ago, 24% of people had no trust in major corporations. Now that we invest so much more in them, 40% have no trust in major corporations. So trust has gone down, but power's gone up. It's a runaway train, isn't it?
I think it's a healthy sign that a population is distrustful of those who yield power. That's usually the basis of the spirit of liberty and the main guarantee against any authoritarian tendencies. But I think the discussion you were having regarding a UN treaty is an important part of the equation. There is also something else that can be done in a much simpler way. We know that large parts of this power comes to corporations because of the gigantic wealth that they accumulate avoiding taxation. We know that the fact that corporations can avoid paying taxations is because countries are in competition one against the other to attract a modicum of taxation by stealing corporations from other countries. So Ireland's business model is to make Google and Apple pay pennies, because those pennies will still be more than what it would have otherwise taken up. And those pennies go to the Irish tax office rather than to the American, the French, or the Italian tax office. It's a beggar thy neighbor competition between states.
That's what I was trying to get at, and you put it so much better than I did. Thank you. Beggar thy neighbour. I like that very much. With you in a minute.
Yeah.
Collins.
Yeah, I think getting back to the question, maybe a bit of a point about the hybrid that I talked about, which is that there will be some aspect of power and control that may be appropriately be held by transnational bodies, such as whether it is the World Trade Organization, the IMF, and so on. And there will be some absolute power that ought to be controlled, which would then allow, by the state, which would then allow some of these uncontrolled aspect or the negative aspect of globalization to be checked by countries. Now, and so in the end, what you have is you have a hybrid model going on. My starting point is, I think it's a nice idea to have a treaty, to have rules and regulations, but we have to go back to the basics. Ultimately, what we have seen is the cooperation is run by elite, often very highly educated, very powerful, knowledgeable, and no matter how powerful a country or weak a country is, they will be able to exploit. And therefore, from my view, as particularly somebody who teaches students, perhaps we're going to start from how we train the next generation of leaders who run these corporations. These corporations are run by men and women, just like us. They are part of society.
But do you have to train them in a moral sense or in a legal, compelling sense? You have to say to them, look, for the better of the world and humanity, you've got to behave in this way? Or do you say to them, if you don't do that, you are in trouble?
So that's a good point. So my starting point is that we train them in a moral sense. We convince them that, well, look, doing it is just good for everybody. It's just good for you, it's good for the society, it's good for the business that you run.
Which brings us back to whether, in fact, what they're doing is for motives other than profit, whether they want it for power, because we've seen what happens with countries that you say to them, you can't do that because you're becoming too powerful or you're being aggressive. Well, we end up with conflict.
Yeah, but then also, any power, be it government power or corporations, they're not absolute. They're not, there's always a conflict of interest and struggle. And that is why in this struggle of interest, it is important that the state will exercise its duty and responsibility to protect people's interests and that of the environment. And
that's all very well if the state is more powerful than the person
but that's a question
against
of
whom
who
they're
do we
trying to
elect.
protect the public.
So when you talk about training people, it's also political education. It's also electing people in governments that will make sure that they are working for the interests of people. And the thing is, with free trade agreements, governments, Lorenzo called it, with another term I call it race to the bottom. So governments sign in all these trade treaties because they think that if they don't do so, they will be left behind because everyone's signing. So the question is, how can people, through their organizations, fight all these free trade treaties? How can they tell governments that don't sign that treaty because, one, first and foremost, these are secretive treaties. Okay. In the UK, even the parliament do not know what those trade negotiators are
let's not start on that one. We've had so many. Lorenzo, just a quick one. I don't know who said it. It may have been in one of your articles, but I thought it was a very good point. He said that the new law is not sovereignty, it is supply and demand.
Well, that's always been the case. I think sovereignty is a grossly overrated term. We've never had anything vaguely resembling the idea of national sovereignty. We've always been thrown in a world of interdependency, of supply and demand, of economic power, and it's been organized political struggles that have managed to be on the side of the many and not on the side of the few. If you ask me what needs to be done now, speaking to a studio in the UK, you need to resist Johnson's idea of transforming the UK into a gigantic tax evasion platform, which is the idea of the free ports that is being touted all over the country. This is precisely what we're talking about, a state power that facilitates tax evasion because it acts in the interests of the very few and oligarchical wealthy of the country that it represents.
But
States
does it not,
don't have
very
so much
quickly,
power,
does it
but they
not
have some
bring
power.
wealth to the many as well because they have jobs, they have spending power?
No, trickle-down economics has been the most discredited economic theory of the recent past. Accumulating wealth has driven concentration of power and has put the vast majority of countries and the middle classes in Western countries, notably, in economic stagnation and lowering social and labor standards.
Oh gosh,
That
listen,
economic
I'm going
model
to have to say thank you. These are so many circular arguments because if you don't have trickle-down economics, if you don't have wealth coming in like that, well, then one of the alternatives is austerity, and we've seen where that's got us. Thank you, Lorenzo. Thank you, Dorothy. No, it's finished. I know there's so much more you want to say.
Yeah.
Collins, we appreciate your time, and thank you for watching this edition of Roundtable. You can catch us on YouTube, TRT World Roundtable YouTube. We hope to see you next time here in the studio. Goodbye for now.